Greetings, AP U.S. History Scholars, for Unit 18. This will be our last short unit before the end of the year on Bush number 43, or Baby Bush, and Barack Obama. And I'm looking at the review sheet from top to bottom here. The election of 2000. You need to know the candidates. Al Gore is running for the Democrats, and George W., not to be confused with his father, George H.W. Bush. George W. is running for the Republicans, and who won is Bush. And Bush wins even though he has approximately 500,000 less popular votes than Al Gore. But remember, to win the presidency in the United States, you need to win the Electoral College. And if you remember this recent election where Hillary got almost 3 million more votes than Trump, it's not the popular vote, it's the electoral vote. And the importance of Florida's vote was essential here. Bush could not win this election without winning the 25 electoral votes from the state of Florida. But when the election night is over, it looks like Bush has won by just several hundred votes in Florida, one of these statistical improbabilities, one of these anomalies here. And Gore's position on the vote is that there needs to be a recount. And this did happen under Florida law with, I think it was like 0.5% of the vote margin. There's by state law, there is a recount. And what Gore demanded, though, was that ballots with dimples, these pregnant, these punch card forms that had a bulge but not a punch out at the perforations, he demanded that these be counted. There's also complaint on the East Coast. There was what you call a butterfly ballot, where the candidates did not match up with the holes that were punched. And a lot of Republicans got punched when somebody else was evidently wanting to vote for somebody else. Anyhow, other accusations, the felony purge list was inaccurate. If you commit a felony in the state of Florida, you never get to vote again. And this list was updated, and people who were eligible to vote, who had similar last names or similar data, were purged. And another issue that Gore had with this whole operation was the state is essentially up for grabs here because of the closeness of the vote and because of the state-mandated recount. And the person who is the governor of the state is Jeb Bush, who is George W.'s brother. And the Secretary of State, the person who's in charge of certifying the state election, was a woman named Catherine Harris, and she just happened to be the one of the chair people for George W. Bush's Florida campaign. So it seemed like there was some unfairness here, and depending on which side, certainly there was bias. The election is going to be argued from Election Day in November all the way until December 12th, when the Supreme Court is going to put an end to it. By 5-4 vote, they're going to give the election to Bush on the basis that Gore was asking for a selective recount. And this is Gore's great blunder. He was cherry-picking the Democratic strongholds on the East Coast, places like Fort Lauderdale and Miami, and ignoring the more red counties throughout Florida. And under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you have to have a standard count here. You have to have a standard procedure for counting votes. And Gore was basically asking for the counts to keep going on until he found enough dimpled or pregnant chads or whatever it was that would push him over. So Bush will win Florida with 537 votes. Kind of a very interesting election. Bush's unilateralism, this is maybe similar to Trump's, this idea of America first, that we are going to go our own way. We're not going to be seeking advice from the world. And one of the things is the 1972 ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which said that we could not set up anti-missile missiles, and we signed this with the Soviets. This is way back when Nixon was president. The idea here is if you do not have a shield, you're less likely to launch a first strike and start a war. And Bush's argument is the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. We're going to protect ourselves, and he pulls out of this ABM treaty. Also, the Kyoto Protocol. Remember, Clinton in 1997 is we're one of the signatories of the Kyoto Protocol, which is an agreement to reduce our carbon emissions to mitigate global warming. Now, keep in mind, when Clinton signed this, he brought it back, and the Senate voted against it 95-0, that basically this was, in a sense, a sellout to third world countries like China, which were not committed to the same timetable as us, even though they significantly more air pollution is coming from China and India, and these two countries didn't have to regulate their industries like we would have had to. Anyhow, Bush basically is throwing us out the window, saying our hands aren't going to be bound by this. He pulls abortion funding from the United Nations, and this is an example of we're putting the United States first. September 11, 2001, or 9/11 as it's commonly called, who attacked the United States. This is an Al-Qaeda attack masterminded by Osama bin Laden. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi Arabians, and the attacks are in 4 places. You have actually 2 attacks on the World Trade Center. The North Tower and the South Tower are both hit, and eventually they collapse after burning for a while. There is an attack on the Pentagon, crash plane into the Pentagon building, and then there is a crash into a field in Pennsylvania. Why does the U.S. invade Afghanistan in 2001? Well, invade Afghanistan because Al-Qaeda has been given sanctuary, has been given refuge by the Taliban government of Afghanistan and a sort of combined Northern Alliance, which is some northern non-Taliban Afghans and U.S. Special Forces, drive this Taliban government and their Al-Qaeda charges out of power. And this war has been a failure because of the lack of a strong central government in Afghanistan. And because of this lack of a strong central government, because of the corruption of this government, the outer, the provinces of Afghanistan basically have drug-dealing warlords with their own armies. So there has been really no ability to create a just, a democratic, an efficient government that whose reaches into the countryside of Afghanistan. And after several years, the Taliban became very resilient, essentially arguing that the U.S. is just one more foreign intruder. Remember, if you remember your world history, Afghanistan had been invaded by Alexander the Great and by the British and by the Soviets most recently. Here are the Americans tromping around and killing Afghans, killing Muslims. These are sort of foreign crusaders, and the Taliban is currently in control of much of the countryside of Afghanistan, and it's basically Americans are helping prop up a very unpopular, corrupt, central, and ineffective government. The fate of Osama bin Laden, well, he hides out until May 2, 2011, and at which point U.S. Special Forces chopper in through the Himalayas, land in Pakistan, and blast their way into his compound, kill him, take his body, and he's gone. So he survives hiding out for about a decade. Muslim nation with the A-bomb is Pakistan. Pakistan has been playing a double game against the United States, allowing us to send supplies to Afghanistan, but deliberately aiding and abetting and giving aid and shelter to the Taliban in the north part of Pakistan along the Afghan border. Why does the U.S. invade Iraq in 2003? Well, we accused the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein of trying to acquire and perhaps having weapons of mass destruction. Let me be more specific there. We said that he did have them. This is the justification. The UN was against us doing this, as were many of our former European allies here. And Hussein didn't make it look like he was up to any good. He refused to allow UN weapons inspectors to have free rein to look for such weapons. Well, after the invasion, no WMDs were found. WMDs refer to chemical weapons, biological weapons, and or nuclear weapons. And there was some reason to think that he may have had at least chemical weapons, because he did use poison gas in his war against the Iranians between 1980 and 1988, and he did use poison gas against Kurdish villages, the Kurdish people in the northern part of Iraq. The fate of Saddam Hussein: he is captured by Americans who turn him over to the new Iraqi government, which tries him and hangs him. Shock and awe refers to the American invasion of Iraq. The idea is we can use a military force about half the size of that which went into, which we used in Desert Storm, because this force is going to be very rapid. It's going to be very mobile. We're going to have guided precision weapons. And the idea is that we're going to move so fast, so ruthlessly, that the Iraqi state will fold, which it does. In 17 days, we are in Baghdad. We've taken the capital city here. But Iraq becomes a disaster after America's invasion. Basically, at least three things happen here. One is when the Iraqi government folds, there's chaos, there's looting, there's anarchy, and there's crime. And this is held against us down the road. Secondly, there are insurgent attacks from Iraqis who resented us being in their country, and it's also called asymmetric attacks, or the Fedayeen. These are basically guerrilla tactics. We're using IEDs, improvised explosive devices, that are blowing up American foot soldiers and tanks and stuff. Maybe some of you saw the Academy Award-winning movie, The Hurt Locker. And Iraq becomes a magnet for terrorists who want to fight Americans. And then to boot, not only are we, fighting criminal chaos, anarchy, and all that, and those who are sniping at Americans and killing us, but there is a civil war between the Shia and the Sunnis, these two Muslim sects that had been kept apart by Hussein, who was a very secular ruler. Why didn't Hussein allow UN weapons inspectors to keep the U.S. from invading? Why did he allow us to think and to tell the world that he had these WMDs? Well, this is maybe perhaps a little bit speculation. In part, he probably didn't believe that we were really going to do anything. We didn't kick him out the first time we fought him in 1991 with Desert Storm, so maybe he didn't really believe that we would pull this off the second time. But it's been supposed here that, remember, he fought an 8-year war with the Iranians. He wanted the Iranians to think he had an atomic bomb, or WMDs. He wanted the Iranians, who are it's a much bigger country, population-wise, military-wise, to have some fear of what he might have up his sleeve. In addition, remember, only about 20% of the Iraqi population were Sunnis, which Saddam Hussein was one of, and it's these Sunnis who are oppressing the other 80%, Kurds and Shia. So he's afraid of his own people. So it's a good thing for people to think that you have all these weapons, even if you don't, or at least it seemed to be. What violence engulfed Iraq after the American invasion? There is civil war. Hundreds of thousands of Shia and Sunni kill each other over the years, and millions flee, internal refugees, external refugees. Differences between the Sunnis and the Shia, or the Shiites. The key thing here is, I'm going to give you a population ratio, which is approximate for the sake of sort of rounding, having numbers that are, you can remember, about 65% of Iraq is Shia, or Shiite. About 20% is Sunni, and the Sunnis are the ones that controlled Iraq. They're the ones that discriminated, and they killed Shia and they killed Kurds. It is believed that over the time that Saddam Hussein was in power, that he killed perhaps 300,000 of his own people. He's not killing Sunnis, he's killing Shia rebels, and he's killing Kurds. And that last 15%, if you're counting the math here, would be Kurds. So about 65, 20, 15, Shia, Sunnis, and Kurds, with that 20% having control until the Americans turned the Sunnis and Saddam Hussein out. Who are the Kurds? Well, the Kurds are this non-Arab group in the northern part of Iraq who, after the Americans invade, sort of set up essentially an autonomous state. They're essentially self-governing. How did the U.S. help cause the disastrous post-invasion consequences in Iraq? Well, two things. The U.S. Governor who was running Iraq until the Iraqi election basically fired everybody who worked for the government. The Ba'ath Party, this party of Hussein, if you belonged to this party, you were cashiered. You were given your pink slip and told to take off. So there's no government. There's nobody running the show. Who's, and there's a whole infrastructure which is going to be looted and is then going to be attacked by insurgents. Also, we fired the entire Iraqi army. So rather than just strip them of their nasty Saddam Hussein favorites, we took these young men who were trained, who had guns, who were testosterone driven, who had nationalist leanings, and we set them loose. And these later become the foot soldiers who are sniping at us, and eventually many of them become the basis of ISIS. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, these are detainment centers. Abu Ghraib is in Baghdad, and Guantanamo is down on the island of Cuba. And these are where we are holding and have held detainees who are not regular soldiers. These are suspected terrorists. These are people we want for interrogation. And these are places where the U.S. military, excuse me, has tortured. And this is not the torture, not, it's a softer torture, but it's torture nevertheless. Slappings, throwing people against walls, subjecting internees to extreme cold, extreme heat, extreme light, noise, putting people in stress positions, making them stand, putting them in sexually humiliating positions, stripping them, threatening them with electric shock, with vicious dogs. And most controversially, waterboarding. Waterboarding is simulated drowning. Basically, you drown somebody to the point where they're going to die, and then you stop pouring water down their throats. And this was something that the Bush administration totally supported. And Bush's argument was that the Geneva Convention did not apply to Guantanamo because these were not soldiers. These were not soldiers in uniform, which is what the Geneva Convention protects. These are just street thugs who are sniping at Americans, who are blowing up our tanks, who are killing the civilian population, and that these are basically just, the worst of thugs who have no rights whatsoever. Iraq's Christian population has about 2/3 of it, about 1.5 million at the start of the war, less than 500,000 today. They have fled. They have been attacked by Muslims on both sides. Remember, Hussein, not particularly religious. He kept the religious tensions in check, and these religious tensions burst, at least the Muslim ones do, burst into the open with his demise. How life is worse in Iraq after the 2003 American invasion rather than before it? Well, looting, lawlessness, anarchy, crime, war, civil war, terrorist attacks, disruption of the water supply, disruption of electricity, the looting of public buildings, attacks on hospitals. Basically, Iraq became a place of violence, of fear, of increased malnutrition, lack of health care. People are hotter in the desert in the desert heat, and this is all attributed to the Americans and their inability to keep control after a stable government was tossed out. Bush's axis of evil. Why are they evil? Well, you've got the Iraqis who are accused of WMDs, and in a sense, Hussein himself was a WMD. You've got the Iranians who have vowed to wipe Israel off the map, and they're actively working on an A-bomb. And then you have the North Koreans with their brutal government and this sort of slave regime, which is building weapons where they are vowing to be able to hit us with nuclear weapons. Some domestic thoughts here on the Bush time in office, his 2 terms. He has 2 back-to-back secretaries of state who are our first African-American secretaries of state. And this is kind of a big deal. If you look at American history, probably next to vice president, secretaries of state are really the next stepping stone into the presidency. And Colin Powell, remember him, he's the guy who was in charge of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during Desert Storm. He becomes the Secretary of State during the first term of Bush, and then later you have Condoleezza Rice. Bush's pro-life support, some examples here. He is an evangelical. A lot of evangelical Christians voted for him because of his opposition to abortion. And under him, you have passed the partial birth abortion ban. This is a ban largely symbolic, but it says that when a baby's being born through the birth canal, you can't puncture the back of its head and suck its brains out. So, this is a victory, which is largely symbolic, and it's upheld by by the Supreme Court. Democrats strongly oppose this. In principle, there should be no limits on a woman's right to abortion, even if the baby is being born. The Unborn Victims of Violence Act. This was also opposed by the Democrats, and this one said that if you're a pregnant woman and there's a crime and somebody shoots you in the belly and kills your unborn baby, that you have killed a human being. And this passes under the Republican administration of George W. Bush, and also the aforementioned ending of U.S. payments through the UN to support third world abortions. No Child Left Behind is this plan to tie federal money for education to testing. If the child doesn't test, then they can't and pass, they can't advance. It's meant to tighten up standards. The new Social Security entitlement, Bush will add prescription medicine to Medicare, and this is kind of a sop to seniors. Remember, the elderly are the most likely to vote, so now there is prescription medicine as part of Medicare. Bush's tax cut effects after 2001, the most massive tax cuts in American history, and the deficit exploded under him. The Patriot Act, this is following the 9/11 attacks, and this allows the government to wiretap telephone conversations and computer surveillance, and this is a violation of civil liberty for privacy, but most Americans have supported this, basically saying, "Hey, I don't have anything to hide. Look for those terrorists who are plotting to do us no good." Signing statements. A little history here. The line item veto, which is something which the president has never had. He's always had to pass everything in a bill passed by Congress, or pass everything or veto everything. Well, Clinton is given the line item veto in 1996, which allows him to just item by item throw things out and pass the rest. Well, the Supreme Court struck this down in 1998. And what Bush said was, I'm still going to do it. I'm going to have a signing statement that I'm going to sign this law, but I will not obey. I will not do this part of what is in the law. And this has become sort of a presidential norm after Bush. Obama did it, as well as George W. Bush. New Orleans, 2005, you have Hurricane Katrina. About 1,500 will drown as a levee gives way in Lake Pontchartrain floods part of the poor section of New Orleans. 2008 banking collapse. This starts under Bush and continues under Obama. And Bush, before he leaves office, gets Congress to pass the Troubled Asset Relief Program called TARP. What this did was it threw $700 billion to the banks, the bankers who caused this collapse by very ill-advised loans, and they're using the people's money for their big roulette wheel. Little editorial comment here. This money was given, no questions asked, to the banks. The plan here is to write some of this bad debt off the books and get the banks loaning money again and get the economy revived. And one of the first things all these bankers did was, whether they were leaving or not, was to give themselves and their underlings huge, massive bonuses. John Roberts, Sam Alito, two conservatives, Supreme Court justices appointed by Bush during his 8-year term. Okay, jumping down to the last section here, Obama, his ethnic background, his father was Kenyan. His father was from Africa. Why did Obama win the Nobel Peace Prize, and why was this a slap at Bush? Well, remember, Bush is a unilateralist. He, in fact, I gave you the examples of canceling the ABM treaty and the Kyoto Protocol and cutting off UN abortion funding. But the big thing is he goes to war against Iraq, even though the UN votes against this. So it's, we're going to do what we want to do. And Obama gets this award very early on in his first term of office for, quote unquote, extraordinary efforts to strengthen diplomacy and cooperation between people, end of quote. So basically he's given this award by promising that he will be a multilateralist, that he will sort of get input from the world before we go off half-cocked doing our own thing. Homosexual rights advances under Obama. Obama ends Clinton's don't ask, don't tell. Basically, you can be openly gay in the military and you will not be thrown out. Obama refused to enforce the Defense of Marriage Act. The Defense of Marriage Act, passed under Clinton, said that the federal government would not recognize homosexual marriage as far as it refers to any obligations the federal government has concerning marriage, such as Social Security benefits. And under Obama, the Supreme Court, in a case called Obergefell versus Hodges, is going to find in the Constitution a fundamental right that that marriage is guaranteed to same-sex couples. So homosexual marriage is legitimized under the Obama administration. Remember, he appoints two left-leaning justices, two women, Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor. They're at the bottom of your review sheet. Sonia Sotomayor is the first Puerto Rican, the first Hispanic member of the Supreme Court. The Gulf of Mexico, 2010, you have the Deepwater Horizon blowout and this massive oil slick that pollutes the Gulf. Obama's promise in 2008 regarding Iraq and Afghanistan, well, basically his promise is to wind the war down and get our troops out. There's fatigue, there's weariness, there's cynicism, there's, let's just get out of this quagmire, this swamp. In Afghanistan, we pull our troops down from about 100,000 to approximately 8,400. There still are troops that are providing air support and military training and stuff like that. But it's very rare nowadays that you hear about an American soldier getting killed in either Afghanistan or Iraq. So pull down from about 100,000 to about 8,000. And in Iraq, when Obama comes in, there's about 170,000 U.S. troops in Iraq, and he pulls that number down to about 6,000. And I'm filming this in May of 2017, and there's some discussion of putting another 2,000 American boots on the ground to sort of do some mop-up against ISIS in the north part of Iraq. GM and Chrysler in 2009 will be going bankrupt, and rather than have these companies fold and lose part of our auto industry, the U.S. government under Obama gives them bailouts. Syria and the Arab Spring. Remember, the Arab Spring is across the Middle East. There are uprisings against these dictatorships and a call for elections and democracy. And one of the countries that bursts into a civil war that begins in 2010 and is lasting until now, 2017, is Syria, with Bashar Assad, their dictator, brutal guy who is basically at war with ISIS. And, you got these two bad guys fighting here. And this is the big conundrum, the big quandary for Obama was he essentially did not engage, he sort of stayed out of the Syrian war. ISIS, what is it? Why does it exist? Well, ISIS is the Islamic State in Syria, and it's also called ISIL, the Islamic State in the Levant. Levant would be the Mediterranean. It is made up of Sunnis, these Sunnis that had been basically thrown out of power. These Sunnis that are the small 20% who are now being excluded from the government by the Shia. There's great alarm. There's great hatred of the Shia as, sort of religious vermin. And ISIS is, this powerful group. How did these terrorists just basically, take over a good chunk of northern Iraq? Well, it's because these are former officers. These are former soldiers. These are people who have got the weapons. And what's it been doing from 2013 to present? They've been trying to set up a caliphate. They've been trying to set up a Muslim state that straddles part of Syria, part of Iraq. They control the second largest city in Iraq, Mosul, which just recently is partially taken back by the Iraqi army. But this is a brutal regime. The plan of ISIS, and these are Sunnis, is to kill Shia, kill as many Shia as possible, kill the Yazidi sect. Christians, basically, they need to convert, leave, or die. There's been mass rape against especially Christians and Yazidi women. And ISIS is just it's just a moral blot on the map. Editorial comment here. Vladimir Putin and Ukraine, two controversies concerning this Russian president in Ukraine. A couple of years ago, Russian troops took over Crimea, which is part of Ukraine. If you look at a map, it goes Russia, Ukraine, and then this piece of Ukraine sticking into the Black Sea, Crimea. And Crimea is mostly Russian ethnics, but the Russians took this over, held a plebiscite, held an election. The Crimeans voted to join Russia. And then Russia, under Putin, has supported a rebellion in the eastern part of Ukraine, an area called the Donbass, Donbass. This is an area with a large Russian-speaking ethnic population, and Putin has stirred up discontent and has sent across the border of supplies and Russian soldiers to help the Russian Ukrainians rebel and hold off the army of the Ukrainian state. So you have here Vladimir Putin sort of carving out a Russian zone of Ukraine. And for this, there is an embargo against him by the Europeans and the Americans. And there's kind of a standoff here, but Putin is doing what he wants to do. China and the South China Sea controversy. The South China Sea, if you look on a map, It's the part of the Pacific that's between China, between Taiwan, between Vietnam, between Taiwan, between Brunei, and between Malaysia. And China claims there's about 250 islands in the sea. Most of them are just, sort of, a lot of them are underwater when it's high tide. No, nobody lives on these islands. They're too small for human habitation. And what's significant is these islands are in an area where there very well might be oil and where there might be mineral resources under the sea. China claims every one of them. China claims the entire South China Sea, according to their old maps. But the neighboring countries also claim many of these islands. And the U.S. position is not to side with anyone, rather to say that no one owns the sea, that this is an area which should be open for international transit and shipping, which puts us at odds with the Chinese. Now, the Chinese are on many of these islands building facts on the ground. They're creating ground. They're basically filling in the sea. They're dredging. They're creating airstrips, military bases, and there's really nobody that can do anything about it. So, interesting situation developing here where the Chinese are claiming and coming up with a military ability to protect their islands, or what they say are their islands, and the Americans who are disagreeing and moving our navy and ships through here, basically trying to make a point. So a little bit of a standoff, sort of waiting to see how this plays out. And again, at the bottom here, Kagan and Sotomayor, these two Supreme Court justices appointed by Obama. So on this is the material that will be on the test. Know this material inside and out. Study hard, study early, study smart. See you there.